Dear viewers and listeners of Khabarhub and Radio Candid, Namaste and good afternoon. Welcome to a very special interview with Professor S.T. Muni. Today we'll be discussing the different aspects of Nepal-India relations. Dr. S.T. Muni is Professor Emeritus at Jawaharlal Nehru University and former Indian diplomat. He is the member of the Executive Council of Manohar Parrikar Institute of Defense Studies and Analyses. He has taught, conducted, and supervised research at Jawaharlal Nehru University, National University of Singapore, Banaras Hindu University, and University of Rajasthan. He served as India's special envoy to Southeast Asian countries on UNSC Reform and represented India's Minister of External Affairs at the 50th anniversary celebration of the Paris Peace Conference held in Phnom Penh, Kampuchea. He was also India's ambassador to Lao People's Democratic Republic. He was invited to address the UN Security Committee on Indian Ocean as a zone of peace at Sochi as a part of the Soviet Union in 1985. Professor Muni was nominated to the first ever constituted National Security Advisory Board of India and was the founding executive member of the Regional Center of Strategic Studies, Colombo. In 2005, he was bestowed with Sri Lanka Ratan, Sri Lanka's highest national honor for a foreign national. Professor Muni, welcome to our very special interview of Khabarhub and Radio Candid. Our first question is, what does the new Nepali Congress government led by Sher Bahadur mean for India? How does India plan to engage with the new government?
Well, New Delhi would always engage positively with any government in Kathmandu, frankly speaking. But there is not much enthusiasm for a government led by Prime Minister Deuba. Though it is the Nepali Congress, New Delhi relationship has always been very positive. But I think in the recent years, they found that Prime Minister Deuba was, more resilient on taking any positions, and particularly on the border issue. India was relying on Prime Minister Deuba, not Prime Minister at that time, to support them, but he sided with Prime Minister Oli. And even otherwise, I think he has been now the leader of the Nepali Congress for a very long time, and the Nepali Congress needs some kind of a change. So there has not been a great enthusiasm, I would say, for the Deuba government. Also because there is always an undercurrent of what you call disbelief or discomfort with the Maoists led by Prachanda, and they are also a part of the government. Therefore, there are reasons why New Delhi is not very enthusiastic. But having said that, I must make it very clear and should not be misunderstood that no government in Delhi would afford to be unnecessarily hostile or unfriendly to any government which is there in Kathmandu. So I think there would be a normal engagement between the Deuba government and New Delhi without any great enthusiasm or any great happiness.
So there is a perception in Nepal that towards the end of his tenure, KP Sharma Oli had taken India into confidence to sustain in power. Had Oli resolved his differences after the high-level visit from India to Kathmandu in 2020?
I think this is true. In the last couple of months, the relationship between New Delhi and Oli had improved significantly. And I would say since last year, when high-level visits took place to Kathmandu, after the border row which was there, which created a lot of tensions between India and Nepal relations. And that happened because Prime Minister Oli was also politically cornered in his own party. And Chinese, on whom he was relying earlier, and the Chinese who were trying to patch up in the party, were also putting some pressure on Oli to compromise with the other factions in the party, particularly Prachanda faction and Madhav Kumar Nepal faction. This, I think, was not acceptable to Oli, and therefore, for his own internal political survival, since the Chinese support would not be there for him if he did not make any compromises, he switched on to a softer posture towards New Delhi. And we have no confusion in India that most of Oli's anti-Indianism has largely been driven by his desire to survive as a prime minister and dominate the Nepal Communist Party. And once it happened that that was not possible, so he softened it. On the other hand, New Delhi also thought that there is no point in unnecessarily dragging on with the tensions and also hostility, particularly when China was becoming very assertive on Nepal, on the whole of South Asia. And there was this major border issue which had been precipitated by Prime Minister Oli. So it was nice to soften on the Nepal side and soften on the Oli issue. I may tactically, I may mention here it also that tactically it suited India, because once Prime Minister Oli became softer to India, his credibility as a nationalist leader who can stand up to India got dented, if not completely eroded. And that suited India because then it sends a message to all the Nepalese that anti-Indianism in Nepal is more politically driven and tactical rather than any genuine one. And that is what actually India's perception is, that India is not against Nepal and Nepalese are not against India. So why this political manipulation of a kind of nationalism which hurts Nepal's interest and which hurts India's interest also. So I think there were reasons and probably some messages. I don't think there was a policy package made in foreign ministry to soften towards Oli. I think it was essentially a rapprochement, a tactical rapprochement between the two prime ministers' offices, the PMO in India and the PMO in Kathmandu, that the relationship between Prime Minister Oli and New Delhi establishment suddenly softened.
Professor Muni, it has been more than 3 years since EPG finalized a joint report with recommendations aimed at redefining the Nepal-India bilateral ties. However, the group hasn't been able to present its report to the Prime Minister of both the countries. It has created lots of noises in Kathmandu. Where does the contention lie?
Well, I think the Nepalese had raised too many hopes on EPG. People like me never had much of the hope on the EPG for a very simple reason, that the governments, when they decide to resolve their issues, they don't need any EPG, frankly speaking. All the issues which were put before the EPG had been under discussion between New Delhi and Kathmandu for a long time. And if they don't want to take unpleasant decisions either way, either Nepal or India, then you set up a committee which will go into for another 2 years. So you buy time out of that. I think the EPG was actually an exercise of buying time between Kathmandu and Nepal to address some of the controversial issues. Now, after the EPG has submitted the report. The problem is not with the EPG. I think they had done their job. The report, there are parts which are not acceptable to Nepal. There are parts which are not acceptable to New Delhi. So New Delhi has formally owned the report. And I think Kathmandu, Nepal has also not formally owned the EPG report. There are some EPG members who have come out, like Ambassador Thapa. They have come out publicly and said something about the EPG. But I haven't heard the Prime Minister very assertively saying that we accept the EPG report. So even Nepal has not accepted. I find a lot of Nepali media writing all the time, India has not accepted the EPG report. Yes, India has not accepted, you are right. But Nepal has also not accepted the EPG report. And largely because there are parts of the EPG recommendations or conclusions which are not acceptable to Nepal. There are parts which are not acceptable to India. Now, having said, after the EPG report, I do find certain change, at least both on Nepal and India side, and certainly on India side, that some of the projects like the oil pipeline project, like some of the Hulaki road, some of the railway connections between Janakpur and, they have been expedited. These are some of the pending projects, firstly. Secondly, so far as 1950 treaty is concerned, India's stated position is we are prepared to revise it and sit down. Tell us how to revise it. And this is for Nepal to say specifically what kind of revisions it wants. Dr. Jaiswal, you should be very clear that the treaty has two pillars. One is the security pillar, where India wants Nepal not to do anything which adversely affects India's security. And second is the developmental pillar, in which India has assured Nepal that whatever you want for development, we will do, including the equal treatment to the citizens within India's economic opportunities. Now, you cannot have one pillar and ignore the other one. And that's what the problem is. Nepal's problem is largely with the security pillar. Nepal's problem is not much with the development pillar. They want to retain the development pillar and want to dilute or completely eliminate the security pillar. That may not be acceptable to India. So there is no treaty which can be finalized or concluded by only one side dictating the terms of the treaty. And that's where the problem is. From Indian point of view, I think former Ambassador Ranjit Rai has recently come out with a book on India-Nepal relations. I think that would be very useful, where it very clearly underlines that, look, this is in the mutual interest, and whatever is acceptable in the mutual interest should be done in revising the treaty. Take the Bhutan example. I don't want to go into that. But Bhutan treaty was revised without much political fuss and hassle. And this can be done in revising the Nepal treaty also if you want to revise. If Nepal doesn't want to revise and abandon the treaty, Nepal should give 1 month's notice. This is 1 month or 1 year, whatever the provision is. This is written in the treaty. And then you can abandon and feel free of the treaty and therefore accept all the obligations and consequences which come out of it. So it's a ticklish problem on both the sides. Therefore, what I see is that some of the issues which were put on the table of the EPG are being addressed, whether EPG has been accepted or not. But whatever the EPG's recommendations might have been on the developmental area, even on the security area, are being accepted, and both the governments are to some extent addressing them. Therefore, EPG issue has almost now become a non-issue, because this was, and the Indian government, some parts of Indian government have said, look, this was a EPG report was meant for the internal consumption of the government. So the government will internally consume whatever it wants to consume. Whatever it doesn't want to consume, it would not consume. And I think same applies to the Nepalese side equally. And therefore, Nepal would accept whatever it wants to accept, would not accept whatever it doesn't want to accept.
There was not a single visit by Indian Prime Minister Dr. Manmohan Singh during his decade-long tenure, while Prime Minister Modi has made 4 official visits to Nepal in 4 years. Has India prioritized Nepal in recent times?
No. See, there was no difference in the UPA and the NDA governments so far as keeping close engagement with Nepal is concerned. You are right that Manmohan Singh did not visit, and many of the Indians were very unhappy. I was very, I've written in several of my articles, this is not done. And I hear that after the change in Nepal, Dr. Manmohan Singh was about to visit, but bureaucracy probably suggested that we must have some big achievement and then you should visit or whatever. I am not explaining anything on Dr. Manmohan Singh's behalf, and it was wrong on his part not to pay visits to the neighboring countries, which Prime Minister Modi has done. There is certainly greater dynamism, and the pace of engagement is much, much faster and much, much wider under Prime Minister Modi. There is no doubt about it. But in terms of the quality of engagement, I think there was no change. all the governments, I would say, would always want to have very close, very friendly, very positive relationship with Nepal.
Sir, is there any change in India's Nepal policy with the change in government in Nepal? What are the continuities and change in Nepal-India relations since Modi came to power?
Well, I think the continuity is to have deep engagement. The change, I would say, is that Prime Minister Modi both reacts positively as also negatively. Positively in the sense that areas where there was inactivity on India's side, Prime Minister Modi has filled them up, like the visits which you just now mentioned, or like picking up the what you call the old projects to be taken and pursued in any seriousness, which he has started doing that. But on the negative side, I would say the Modi administration is comparatively more assertive on India's interest than the previous governments in India had been. The previous governments of India, if Nepal did not respond, they somehow let things slip by. But the present government, and I think if you study Prime Minister Modi's neighborhood first policy, it is very clearly stated that neighborhood first means priority to the neighbors, but not priority at the cost of India's vital interests. Now, therefore, whenever there is a question of India feeling bad about its vital interests being affected, I think Modi's India would respond or react more strongly than any other previous government. Maybe you forget about Mrs. Gandhi's time. Previous government, certainly of either Atal Bihari Vajpayee or Dr. Manmohan Singh, would have reacted. So that's the one difference. Secondly, I find under Prime Minister Modi, there is a great deal of emphasis on the cultural and civilizational ties between the two countries. Development is on the forefront. And I think there is a greater emphasis now. More money has been allocated for developmental projects in Nepal. And as I mentioned to you, some of the projects which were being delayed earlier are being expedited now. So there is a lot of dynamism, lot of activism which is taking place, and there is a lot of cultural emphasis on relationship. Like Prime Minister Modi's desire to visit Janakpur, Prime Minister Modi's emphasis on developing Lumbini, Prime Minister Modi's visit. I mean, many of the prime ministers have visited Pashupatinath, but the manner in which Prime Minister Modi visited was to send a very strong message that we value civilizational and cultural bonding that exists between India and Nepal far more strongly than any other would have been done. So these are some of the changes which have taken place, but there is no let-up. Let us be very clear. There is no let-up in India's security concerns, whether it relates to the border, whether it relates to China, or whether it relates to the terrorist aspect.
Sir, you said that there was no change in UPA and NDA government. However, there were debacles in Nepal-India relations a couple of times. For example, the blockade and the border issues between Nepal, India, and others.
No, yes, I mean, I mentioned to you that Prime Minister Modi's government would react strongly. And that was what it was reflected in the blockade. That was what it reflected in the constitutional amendment. That was what it was also reflected on the border issue. And I think that is what it will continue to reflect so far as proximity of Nepal with China is concerned, which may affect India's economic and strategic interests. So wherever India's interests are directly affected, I mentioned to you that Modi government has reacted more strongly. So it's, I mean, blockade may be one of the reasons. But you know, Pramod, blockade was one example of Modi's foreign policy. And the pipeline is another example of Modi's foreign policy. And both these things are missing from the previous administration. But both these things underline that the dynamism of Modi's foreign policy towards Nepal is very clearly evident. And assertion of India's interest in Nepal in Modi's foreign policy is also very evident.
Sir, you just talk about 69-kilometer cross-border pipeline, which was inaugurated between Nepal and India in September 2019. It was completed 15 months ahead of the schedule and is the first of this kind in South Asia. What went wrong on previous Indian development projects in Nepal? Why have many Indian development projects long delayed in Nepal?
Look, Dr. Jaiswal, I am of the opinion that India's foreign policy suffers from a major disease. And that disease is a delivery deficit. Many of the promises made by Government of India are not delivered or are not delivered to the satisfaction of the targeted country. And that's not in relation to Nepal alone. You know, I think the Nepalese must understand it very clearly that this is how the Indian system works. India's bureaucracy, India's democratic system, India's old imperial laws in bureaucracy, the divisions between finance and defense, between finance and foreign affairs, between home and foreign affairs, these divisions of the various ministries working in different levels are very difficult to coordinate. And that lack of coordination makes many of the projects suffers. Let me pause for a while and say that in many cases, whenever there have been tensions between India and Nepal relations, Nepalese side has also delayed some of the project in terms of grant of land or grant of permissions and all that. So it's all accumulated to delay a certain project. And those delays, as I mentioned, I mean, we see these delays of the government promise and government practice even at home. A certain road is laid down and then that road would not be completed. It should be completed in 6 months. It would not be completed for 6 years. And the project may be abandoned. So this is a real problem. And I think the Indian system is now aware of it, but it cannot suddenly, become very efficient. And this is where Indian foreign policy really suffers in terms of competing with China. Not in intent or not in terms of commitment, but in terms of delivering. And this is where the problem is, which I agree with you that earlier, even now I would say the speed of projects would be far slower than any other country the Japanese can deliver or the Chinese can deliver.
Sir, time and again, there are rumors in Kathmandu that the BJP wants to revive the monarchy or Hindu state in Nepal. According to you, what is the future of monarchy or revival of Hindu state in Nepal?
Well, you're right. I mean, the BJP has not come out with any direct and clear statement whether it wants to revive monarchy and wants to revive Hindu state or not. But my very sincere understanding and feeling is that there are powerful sections within the BJP, probably supported by sections of the RSS, which would be very happy if Nepal became a Hindu state. They would also be very happy if monarchy is brought in back. There may be sections even in the administration which may find that it was easier to deal with one man, that is king, and therefore so many leaders in democracy, we cannot handle it. It's better to have a king. There may be many thinking like that. But having said that, there are two things very clear. I see no prospects of monarchy's revival or Hindu states revival so far as Nepal is concerned. Why it is so? Because monarchy did not deliver to Nepal and Nepali people. Otherwise, it would not have been thrown out. Monarchy has not been thrown out because of India or anybody else, no matter whatever the king says, the former king says, but this is a fact. So I don't see any chances of the political space in Nepal has now been occupied and completely eroded from the monarchy. I know of the demonstrations and show of strength which was done in Kathmandu by the pro-royalist people in favor of monarchy, in favor of Hindu state, but I don't see much prospects of their revival at all. they may be unhappy when some of these sections may be unhappy, but very clearly I see. And secondly, it is in none of India's interest to revive monarchy, because what the Indian administration gets worried about is the growing Chinese influence, growing Pakistani influence. They were all brought in during the king's time. And the king has defied India much more than any other leader has defied in Nepal-India, or did not care about India. So I don't see any rational reason or rational logic for India to change its policy in these two respects. A Hindu state, Nepal has never been a Hindu state, except for what you call King Mahendra's time, when he started referring to a Hindu state. Before 62, Nepal was a Hindu country. It's a Hindu society. We respect that. Everybody, we are a large majority of Hindu. But turning the state Hindu into a religious state is no good for minorities and no good for the people there. And it has been proved. Therefore, even before 62 constitution change, which King Mahendra brought about, Nepal was not officially a Hindu state. So there is absolutely no reason to say that since we are Hindu, we should be a Hindu state. But anyway, that is for the Nepalese to decide. I don't say it is in India's interest at all. Though, as I said, I concede that there are sections in India, there are certainly sections in BJP and RSS, and maybe some pockets of administration, because they always go by whatever the ruling party's mood is, who may want some change in Nepal, but the state in India as such, I don't think would ever go in favor of this decision.
There is increasing tension between India and China since the Doklam incident. How is it going to impact Nepal-India relations?
Well, Nepal, it would not impact in any big way. The Chinese economic competition and Chinese push into South Asia is much bigger than the push into Nepal. So if India has to deal with China, it has to be dealt both at the regional level, at the Asian level, at the international level. Nepal is a very small, area in terms of worrying from China. But Nepal is a very vital area in terms of worrying from China because of security, because of open border, because of cultural links and all that. Therefore, India would prefer not to see growing Chinese influence in Nepal. There is no doubt about it. And India economically cannot compete with the money which the Chinese can flow in. But India's intent in terms of developing Nepal are good. Its way of doing things needs to be improved. And for competing with the Chinese, India would always insist that any government in Nepal should avoid doing things which hurt India's interest and favors the Chinese interest. I mean, that's all I can say. Otherwise, India-China relationship is much bigger. So far as trade is concerned, I think India has much bigger trade with China than Nepal has. And China would want to have trade with India. It might even use Nepal as a corridor for trade with India. But all these reasons are very, very clear that economically, India and China will have to remain engaged. Strategically, if they challenge each other, as the Chinese are challenging, then it would create to all kinds of tensions, not only in relations with Nepal, but also in relation to other countries. There are problems in Sri Lanka. There may be problems in Bhutan. If Bhutan tomorrow establishes diplomatic relations and the Chinese influence starts growing, there are problems in Myanmar. There are problems in Maldives. There are problems even in Bangladesh to some extent. Therefore, China is a major concern of India's diplomacy and foreign policy in South Asia as a whole, not only Nepal. But Nepal is special in the sense that our ties with Nepal, India's ties with Nepal are very close and very widespread and deep, whether it is a question of economic relationship, developmental relationship, it is a question of civilizational and cultural relationship, political relationship, security relationship, and whatnot.
Professor Muni, thank you so much for your time. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Great pleasure.
Thank you, sir.